Before we dive into today's story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel.
"You're pathetic, always have been," Angela said, loud enough for every plate to still clatter in its own silence. I'm Michael Hayes, 44, from Toledo, Ohio, and the room I had built with my hands went still like a town after a storm. The words hit me first like wind across dry glass. Then I felt Emma's fork stop halfway to her mouth and the color leave her face. My in-laws, Harold and Gloria, smiled the way vultures smile, polite, precise. Brandon Pierce, standing at the edge of the dining room like he owned the light in the chandelier, didn't bother to smile at all. He looked at me like a judge who'd already written the sentence. It was Thanksgiving or a mockery of it. Angela's family tradition, heavy with casseroles and opinions. I had come home from the night shift at the warehouse an hour early, heart full of a stupid secret and the kind of hope that makes men do reckless things. I had wanted for once to watch the way surprise softened faces, to hold Emma by the shoulders while she squealed, to see Angela's eyes widen and then water with gratitude. Instead, the silence in that house folded over me and Angela leaned back with that slow, effortless cruelty she kept like a talisman. She said, "We deserve someone with ambition, Michael," and the room nodded. Gloria clucked. Harold cleared his throat. Emma stared at the table as if it were a wound. "Brandon here, he has real success. He has a house in Ann Arbor, people he knows, a business. He can give us more than you. You work 2 jobs and still can't provide what we need." 2 jobs. The phrase was accurate like a diagnosis. I had been a warehouse picker by day, loading trucks with other men's ambitions, and a dishwasher closer at Marlowe's diner by night. I had a sleep schedule the color of broken clocks and hands calloused into maps of every package I touched. I had no suits that fit right, no LinkedIn profile that glittered. I had come home smelling of motor oil and coffee, and for 14 years that smell had stood for everything I was, and everything I wasn't supposed to be. Angela's words were a public thing. They weren't whispered in the bedroom or tossed like a bone across the lawn. They were flung across the dining room like a lit match. I heard the neighbor's footsteps through the thin walls, felt the way the futon in the living room sagged under where I would have stood proud if I could. Emma's eyes were wide. She was the person I wanted to protect more than anything, more than the mortgage, more than the small, pinprick promises that had kept me going. I had thought of that face all afternoon as I rode the late bus after the night shift, thinking about how I'd tell her, how we'd laugh and then plan and then be safe. Angela continued, her voice low and perfect for maximum damage. "We can't fool ourselves, Mike. We need to move on. Gloria and Harold can help us until Brandon gets us settled. You'll understand." She smiled, a practice thing, and I felt the floor drop 3 inches under me. If humiliation were a coin, that table exchanged it. Harold made a joke about settling for less, and everyone laughed like they'd rehearsed it. Brandon crossed the room to Emma and, with a hand on her shoulder that stank of cologne and confidence, said, "We'll take care of you, kiddo." Emma's chin trembled. She looked at me, and the look was an accusation and a heartbreak at once. I had carried the secret of the ticket in my back pocket all day, a creased slip of paper, cheap and ridiculous, the kind of thing regular people bet on when they wanted the universe to wink. I had bought it at a gas station at midnight after the warehouse shift, hands shaking with fatigue and a noise in my chest that felt like possibility. "Just one," I told the clerk. He laughed and said, "Good luck, buddy." I had walked home under sodium lamps, thinking of the ways my life might change in 3 numbers, imagining the sound of Angela's laughter turning soft and surprised. I had rehearsed this moment in my head in the fluorescent dark of the bus, in the steamy glow of the diner, in the quiet that sits between 2 alarms. I had pictured handing the ticket across that same oak table and letting everyone watch their lives tilt. Instead, they tilted away from me. They left 2 hours later. Angela and Brandon and Harold and Gloria took Emma and a single overnight bag, and the kind of certainty that belongs to people who do not know what it's like to have every cent counted. They went out into the November cold, and the pickup idled at the curb with Brandon at the wheel. Keys flashing, the lights of Ann Arbor, and the promises that hang over it like paper lanterns. Emma walked past me without looking. I remember the sound of her hair catching the porch light as the truck pulled away. It was the smallest, cruelest sound. When the driveway emptied, I stood in the doorway like a man whose shadow has been stolen. I put the ticket in my hand and looked at it as if it were a live thing, because it was. Because in the inked numbers and barcode, the world had folded in on itself and made a secret that belonged only to me. That night, I did not follow. I made coffee, scrubbed a sink clean enough to make ghosts look respectable, and stood in the kitchen until the sun suggested a morning. I thought of running, grabbing my coat and the ticket and chasing the truck down and begging Emma to come back. I thought of smashing Brandon's face in, of the ledger of names that might be crossed off in red. I thought of calling the police and telling them that my family was being taken and unfairly traded for someone else's brightness. But those were the violent, raw things men think when they are pushed to the edge. When the hour came and no dignified thunder arrived, I folded the ticket into the lining of my jacket and went to cash it. I walked into the bank with the ticket pressed against my ribs like a prayer. The teller took my breath, eyeing my workwear, the hands that told of 2 shifts. She checked, and then the world very carefully mentioned the number. I remember it like a struck chord. $345 million. The words had weight. They had the size of a house in them and the quiet hum of bees. I left without a banner, without fireworks, and I didn't tell a soul. I withdrew a portion of the funds in discrete amounts over the next few days, opened accounts under names that meant nothing to anyone I knew, hired a lawyer with steady hands named Claire Bennett, and a banker who explained tax shelters and patient sentences. I rented a small office under a different name and paid cash for things that felt absurd. A clean apartment with sunlight that came in at the right angle, a car that didn't rattle, a suit that made my shoulders remember how it felt to stand like a man who belonged to no one. It was never about vengeance at first. It was about erasure, erasing the bruise of being laughed at, the feeling of my dignity folded and placed on a side table. I wanted simply to breathe without someone else's voice telling me I was small. I wanted Emma to have options and not to think that numbers on a paycheck were a character judgment. But revenge is patient and cunning. It can live in the space where dignity is reclaimed. I let it take shape in the life I quietly built. Months slid by. I watched Angela's posts through the kind of surveillance small men and broken hearts perform. The public Facebook updates, the pictures of brunches, the wide-toothed smiles taken at events that were new to their family. Brandon's face appeared in a dozen glossy photos, his jawbone and tie prominent, his name attached to seed round and app launch like banners. They moved to Ann Arbor. They were photographed at a charity gala, all collared shirts and pretended concern. They sent an Instagram of Emma with a new bike and the caption, "New beginnings." And the comments flooded with emoji hearts. I did not go to their door. I did not call. I watched, and my watching was not the desultory observation of a man with nothing to do. It was strategy. I built, not loud, not showy. A house on the other side of the river, modest but warm, paid in full. A scholarship in Emma's name at her high school to be used however she wished. Anonymous donations to organizations that helped men with multiple jobs find stability. I bought a small construction company and kept its name simple. I paid fair wages. People who worked for me had checks that did not demand a second mortgage. I hired a mechanic I trusted, not because it would earn me anything, but because I had been that man waiting for fair treatment, and I knew the shape of gratitude. Brandon's company, for a while, was everything he had promised in his photos. He gave interviews and the local paper called him a visionary. Angela posted pictures of him at a rooftop bar with the caption "So proud." Harold and Gloria sent me postcards from weekends at bed and breakfasts that smelled of lavender. Each of their small public triumphs was a salt on my tongue. It would have been easier to watch them flounder publicly, to step in and shine a light on every blemish. But I did not want their humiliation to be a spectacle crafted by me. I wanted it to bloom of its own rot, so that when it collapsed it would be undeniable. Still, the betrayals increased in later months in subtler, crueler forms. Angela called me generous once at a family party, which was her shorthand for pathetic, and the word felt like tissue between 2 fingers. Harold sent me a bill for vacation expenses with a note that read, "We thought you'd cover this." The sentence smeared with expectation. Gloria left passive-aggressive voicemails asking for help moving furniture, and then hung up as if she expected me to appear in a suit of obligation. There were little tests, small petitions for the sort of cash that was never supposed to be mine. They called me at ugly hours, sending texts that were thinly veiled instructions for behavior. "Mike, if you loved us, you'd help with this." They assumed that money would bend like a knee. Each time I said no. When Gloria asked for a $5,000 loan to relaunch a business idea, I wrote a check to a women's entrepreneurship fund instead, in her name but with a receiver who would not let her take the money for personal luxuries. When Harold asked for an investment to partner with Brandon, I suggested he seek independent counsel and forwarded him the contact information for a firm that specialized in due diligence. I did not revel in their small defeats. I did not throw them pennies to watch them scramble. My refusal was not dramatic, it was cold, necessary, measured. The first real fracture came when Brandon's company announced a partnership with a venture that had all the red flags of a gold-plated con. I had watched Brandon's ascent like a man tracking a fire in a dry forest. His appetite grew faster than his capacity. He borrowed money to acquire prestige. He rented offices with glass walls and hired a PR firm to curate his smile. He put on a persona of certainty he did not own. Investors came because of the heat he generated, not the foundation beneath him. One Saturday morning, Claire called me into her office with a folder that smelled faintly of printer ink and worry. "They've been cutting corners," she said without preamble, and handed me the documents. Rounds of unsecured debt, offshore accounts with clever names, 3 shell corporations tied together like a noose. Her finger tapped across spreadsheets that had margins where numbers had been moved like chess pieces. "If this hits the press, it's not just Brandon. Anyone associated with him will burn." My pulse did a quiet, precise thing. I had choices. I could be the man who quietly had the power to pull a thread and watch a tapestry unravel. Or I could be the man who kept his head down and let nature take its course. The temptation to orchestrate retribution was heavy and sweet, but it was not mine for the taking. I was not a vindictive man when it came to cruelty. My anger was more domestic, more humane. I wanted the people who had hurt me to lose the arrogance they wore like perfume, and I wanted them to feel the small, precise pain of consequence. I called a reporter. Not to shout my triumph, but to share documents. I handed over what Claire allowed me to, records that had gone past the point of plausible deniability. The reporter, a woman named Dana Ellis, who smelled of old coffee and relentless questions, asked me why I was helping. I said, because the world needs to be honest sometimes, and then I left the office and did not watch her work. She published the first piece anonymously. Startup implosion. Questions surround leadership, debt. It took 13 hours for the avalanche to begin. Brandon's name was on the front page of the business section within 2 days. The investors demanded audits. The bank froze accounts. The press found angles to chew on and would not let go details. Invoices from non-existent vendors, a payroll line that paid a consulting firm in Belize with no trail. Brandon's smile on the early photos soured into statements. He called Angela and left messages I could imagine like knives. Harold went pale in public appearances, and Gloria deleted a cascade of photos from their feed. Their social world, the soft scaffolding they'd leaned on, began to creak. It wasn't instant annihilation. That would have been too neat. It was a slow eroding. The charity gala where Brandon had once posed with donors now felt like a hall of mirrors. Invitations evaporated. People who'd once dined with them over risotto now used the same room for meetings and kept their lips pressed. There were lawsuits filed and countersuits and the staccato of legal teeth. Brandon was arrested a few weeks later, not in a cinematic way, cuffed quietly at his office while Angela watched the cameras and the sound of his voice trailing like smoke. He was charged with fraud and misrepresentation. The bank accounts froze and the promise of Ann Arbor whitened into a notice of foreclosure. Angela sent a message to my lawyer that read, "Mike, we made a mistake. We need help." It was short and brimming with something like regret and something like calculation. I read it twice. I could have shown up at the courthouse with an open checkbook and cured the wound with money alone. I could have walked in, a man with flawless suits and a ledger that closed all wounds and wiped their slate. But I had learned something during the nights of washing plates, during the packages loaded at dawn. Money doesn't make people honest. It makes liars more expensive. Instead, I forwarded the message to a non-profit that specialized in supporting families when a primary earner was suddenly charged with financial crimes. I paid for Emma to have legal counsel separate from Angela's, because a child doesn't need to be collateral in adult ruin. I had the power to buy their silence, their gratitude, their return. But gratitude bought like that becomes a paper that tears when wind comes. I wanted a deeper lesson to be learned, one of the sort that leaves a mark. The first time I saw Angela after Brandon's arrest, it was from across the courthouse lawn. She was thinner, the kind of thin that hurt instead of elegant. Harold walked with a cane now, which he said was an old man's exaggeration, but his jaw had the permanent look of a man who had bitten down on a lie. Gloria looked old enough to be bitter and too young to be that tired. Emma stood between them with her hands in her coat, and when she looked at me, really looked, there was a slow, narrow dawning. They had lost friends. People separated themselves carefully. We had no idea, they'd say, and their feet would angle toward the exit. Credit cards closed. The house went on the market. Their names were the subject of whispered speculation at cafes, the kind that makes you feel like feverish gossip is a public health crisis. I could have taken the stage then and let them know who had held the knife and why. They could have known that the man they had spit on had the power to fix everything, but I did not intend to become the hand that stitched up their wounds. I had turned my back once and it had taught me how to breathe. Their collapse was not only external. I watched them at Thanksgiving the year after in reflections that belonged to other people. A photo surfaced, Angela, with hollowed cheeks, at a shelter handing out plates while a photographer took the long version of humble. Harold was seen at a bankruptcy hearing with his head lowered. Gloria sold her jewelry in a pawn shop in a strip mall, the clerk's offer as blunt as a judge's gavel. The once lofty family that had once sipped wine and made cruel jokes about settling now had to take numbers and sit under fluorescent lights. The world was less kind to them than they had been to me. I had not made a spectacle of my wealth. I never posted photos of mansions, never broadcast my bank statements at breakfast. But word got out in the way any truth will. Contractors whispered about a clean, punctual client. Kids at Emma's school heard rumors of a scholarship. A local paper ran a piece on a construction company owner who paid weeks with no questions and had a rule against tipping his workers into debt. My name was not shouted from rooftops, but the proof of what I had became available in small, stubborn facts. It was like perfume in the air. You didn't have to see the bottle to know it had been used. Months later, when Angela appeared at the gate of the small house I had bought on the other side of the river, she looked like someone who'd been changed by weather and weather worry. She was there early in the morning, shivering in a cardigan, and she knocked on the screen door with a knuckle that trembled. I opened it because I'd rather face people than avoid them forever. Avoidance felt like its own kind of cowardice. Emma stood a yard behind Angela, too tall to be a child and too weary to be the young woman she'd once been. "Mike," Angela said, and there was a sound in it that had once been music and now was a plain instrument. "Please, we need help. Brandon took everything, and now—" Her words were simple as broken glass. The plea was both a confession and an expectation that I would fix it. Emma's eyes didn't plead. They searched for something else, a sign that I remained the man she had known, or the man they had left. There was a beat where I saw the child who used to fall asleep on my shoulder in the passenger seat after midnight runs to the grocery store, that little body warmed against my arm like a small, perfect safe. Then she stepped forward and said, "You abandoned us." The sentence didn't want for cruelty. Abandon had the shape of the wound they had made. I could have thrown money at them. I could have drawn the curtains and let the coins cascade and watched them learn how to live with that kind of mercy. Instead, I spoke in the voice I'd used to speak to men who had been given second chances. Quiet, direct, without flourish. "I didn't abandon you," I said. "I left because I couldn't stand being used like a doormat. I left because I wanted to be more than the man you thought I was." Angela's face crumpled like fabric being wrung. She said something about mistakes and pride and being young. Harold, who had not been with them that morning, arrived later with a checkbook in his hand and a face made of contradiction. "We were scared, Mike," he said. "We thought we could be richer faster," Brandon promised. Harold's voice died into the promise. He reached into his purse and pulled out a folded paper, a letter asking for my help to avoid destitution, lists of debts, the kinds of numbers that make practical men pause and private men consider. It was painful and private and tawdry, like watching someone comb their hair in a public restroom. I offered them what mattered to me. I gave Emma an option to stay with me, to go to school with a scholarship, and to have a future we could plot together. I paid a lawyer to find a way to salvage Harold and Gloria's remaining stability that required them to account for their choices and to be honest about the mess they'd made. I refused to pay Brandon's debts or to rehabilitate their social circle that would have forgiven them without learning. I refused to be the mechanism of their absolution. The consequences hit them like a winter storm. Brandon's trial made him a figure in the newspaper, his betrayal argued over in opinion pieces. He pled guilty to several counts and got a sentence that would make a man look old before his time. Angela's name was attached to him in a dozen interviews, not as a partner in crime, but as the woman who chose the bright thing over the steady man in the driveway. Her friends, those who had judged me, reoriented slowly. Some admitted they had been shallow, some did not. The people who had always loved me did not need to be convinced. Money could not erase their humiliation, but it could complicate it. Harold, once loudly proud, now helped at a food bank and learned the value of a meal he didn't write a check for. Gloria took classes at the community college and turned over new resume pages with a slow, stubborn pride. Angela volunteered at a shelter and then at a youth center, and I suppose part of her was seeking penance and another part was finding a place where she could belong without the glitter of someone else's spotlight. Public shame has many shapes. For Brandon, it was the flatness of a man whose face no longer commanded a room. For Harold and Gloria, it was the way the neighborhood no longer asked them over for wine nights. It was the look people gave them that mixed pity and judgment. They sold the house. They lost clients and invitations and the little things that make life feel like a town square. At first, the fall felt like joy to the observers who had once been merciless toward me. I remember the sensation, brief, like a sugar spike, of watching karma do what it claims to do. But the pleasure soured fast because I am not a man who rakes embers. My victory was not sweet, it was complicated. I had not wanted to see them small, I had wanted to be seen as worthy. I'd wanted Emma to be safe. The world giving back what it had given me had a hollow ring to it. There were moments, a Thanksgiving years later, when the theater of our lives turned into something gentler. Angela and I sat across from one another at a community center, handing out meals to people who had less than we did. She had lost much and gained the quiet dignity of someone who had been humbled. She didn't look at me the way she once had. That look had been replaced by an adult respect that was not love nor hate, but something necessary and honest. Emma was there, grown into a woman who knew how to cook for 50 without flinching. She smiled at me across the table, and I recognized that smile as the thing that had kept me going. Not proving anything to the world, but keeping the small, private covenant between parent and child intact. The worst thing for them was not that I had money. The worst thing for them was that I had chosen not to deliver their punishment with cruelty. I had made them face the consequences of their choices and then given them exactly what I had been given years before, a chance to rebuild on different terms. It was the slow, Baroque kind of justice that doesn't make headlines, the one that accumulates like dust until something precious must be cleaned. People asked me later if I ever missed the son-of-the-garage version of myself. They asked if I had wanted to change my life into a story of showy revenge. I would tell them the truth because truth, even when plain, tastes better than contrived sweetness. I missed the nights when my hands smelled of engine oil and coffee because those smells were honest. I missed the tired camaraderie of men who did not pretend. But I did not miss the cringing at a table when the people I loved stood and walked away because a better light had been switched on elsewhere. There were costs. I lost a good part of my innocence, the naive belief that hard work always equals fairness. I learned to navigate lawyers and accountants and to listen for people who smelled like desperation. I learned to be patient in a way that felt like armor. I slept sometimes with the weight of money on my chest and thought of all the men who still worked 2 jobs and never glimpsed such a thing. I am not proud of every choice I made, nor do I pretend that I was a saint. When the dust finally settled, the visible consequences had done their work. Brandon went to prison for a term that would etch lines into his face I could not miss. Harold and Gloria moved into a smaller house and learned the blunt arithmetic of necessities. Angela endured the long, slow reclaiming of dignity through work that mattered. They were not destroyed. They were chastened. That, for me, was the miracle. The satisfaction was not that they were ruined so much as that they had to look themselves in the mirror and answer for what they'd done. My life, meanwhile, settled into an odd shape. I chose to remain, in the public mind, a modest benefactor and a quiet businessman. I continued to work, not because I needed to, but because work kept me honest. I oversaw projects, paid people a living wage, and taught apprentices the small mercies of labor. I cooked on Sundays sometimes and tinkered with old radios, finding in their gears patience that no banker could buy. I sent Emma a card on her birthdays and listened to her talk about college as if I were learning something new. People sometimes asked why I never flaunted my money, why I made no spectacle of the life I'd purchased. I think it was because I understood, finally, that money doesn't make you moral. It simply gives you the option to be humane or to be petty. I chose humane because petty had the same feel as their laughter. Years later, when a documentary crew came to do a piece about community builders in Rust Belt cities, they wanted the drama, the jackpot, the betrayal, the revenge. They wanted me to point and speak sharp about who had wronged me. I agreed to one interview and no more. The director asked me if I regretted anything, and I told him this: I regretted the moments I had been small. I regretted letting anger shape me into someone who measured himself by other people's discomfort. I wanted a life that wasn't a headline. I wanted to be a man who could sit at a table and make decent coffee for strangers. The last years of their humiliation were not a circus. They were a set of pragmatic reckonings. Harold found work at the hardware store stacking paint with hands that had never shied from labor. Gloria started an online knit shop and learned to be proud of making scarves that were not part of any gala costume. Angela took classes and later became a counselor for women whose lives had been reshaped by men who promised the moon. She told me once, in a voice less sharp than before, I thought success would fix me. It didn't. It just made me more of what I already was. At the end of that long, slow climb back, there was a scene I did not anticipate. Emma, now 24, stood at a graduation stage and introduced me as her father. She said, "My dad taught me how to fix a breaker, how to change a tire, how to be practical. He also taught me something about strength that isn't loud." She did not mention the ticket or the money. She mentioned the small things that had made a life. The pride in her voice felt like a final seal. People like tidy finales, blood and spectacle, and a clear moral, but real life rarely offers that. What I had wanted for so long was not the public torture of those who hurt me. I wanted to be seen as a man who had survived, who had done right by the people he loved, and had learned to keep himself intact in a world that enjoys measuring names. I am scarred. The edges of old wounds remain. I hold the memory of Angela's voice, and the way the room laughed like a sound that belonged to someone else's life. But I also carry the softer things, the way Emma's hand fits in mine now. The hum of a crew that gets paid on time and doesn't fear winter rent. The bread rising in a kitchen where there is no dinnertime theater of cruelty. Justice, when it finally arrived, was not a gavel or a shouted headline. It was the consequence of choices, theirs and mine, unspooling until the truth could no longer be denied. They found out when they were hungry, and when the lights went off, that the man they had mocked had not been what they'd mocked. I had become untouchable not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I had the distance to choose dignity over rage. In the end, the story I tell people isn't about winning a ticket. It's about what a man does when the world tries to tell him who he's allowed to be. I got lucky, that is true. Luck bought options, but it didn't buy character. Character is how you spend your time when nobody is watching. If there's one thing that remains with me like a single honest medal, it's this: don't let other people's measure of you become your prison.
Betrayal leaves scars, but sometimes it also leaves lessons. What lesson did this story leave with you? Share it in the comments, and let's see how many of us have walked through the same kind of fire. And if you want more stories like this, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next one.